I'm interested in the development of the whole person and in the ways that education can serve that aim. In my work, I focus on mentorship and the contributions of many cultures to how we think about mentorship and how we do it. Today, I'm going to be talking about implementing mentorship within the structures of education. And because building mentorship shares many characteristics with other kinds of building, I'd like to start with an example, a cultural example from architecture. Here's a building. It's the Pyramid of Djoser in Egypt. It was built by the ancient Egyptians almost 5,000 years ago, and it was a colossal effort involving tens of thousands of people to build this structure. At the time, it was the largest structure yet created by humans. They built it in 5 levels. They started with a square mastaba, a sacred tomb, and then they added things on top of it. 5 levels, each of which got smaller as they got higher. As they got higher, the structure became more unstable, more self-limiting, and more predetermined. Each layer represented smaller and more constrained versions of the original vision that they had in mind. So the eventual result of this was that the original inspirational structure, which you can see there by the arrow at the bottom, that sacred purpose of the building was mostly buried. Now it is a repository for camel urine, essentially. What they learned, what the Egyptians learned from this process, was that sometimes when you add new parts to an existing structure, it makes it worse, not better. Then they spent 100 years learning how to make the perfect building. And then they did it. They built the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khufu. Again, a colossal effort. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on this building over many, many years. But note that they didn't renovate or repurpose the older structure. They built it from scratch. The Great Pyramid represents a fundamentally new kind of architecture. They could not possibly have built it by using the tools and materials and strategies that they used in the first building. It needed to be brand new, incorporating the learning from before, but brand new. So sometimes it's best to build from scratch. I think that's a very deep lesson from a very ancient culture. So now let's look at another building, modern education. This photo looks like a very old-fashioned classroom, but aside from the fashions and perhaps the furniture, this looks very similar to the classroom of today. It hasn't changed all that much. We've had, like the ancient architects, we've had accretion in the area of learning and how we implement education. We've added about 5 levels on top of the original structure from when we started. We added the notion that desks, chairs, and classroom experiences were fundamental to learning. That somehow being in a classroom was in itself a sacred thing, an important thing. And the classroom became the defining imprint of modern education. We also developed the notion of fixed timetables, programs, and pathways so that students would have a clear set of steps to follow. And originally, the vision of that kind of step process was so that we would be clear and precise about what we were doing. But as time has gone on, it's become clear that some of that precision is at the sacrifice of flexibility. It's like the levels on top of the step pyramid are getting smaller and smaller. And we have now very fixed and precise disciplinary divisions all across education. Lots of closed systems, lots of siloing, lots of challenges around how we reach across the domains to make a common connection between people who are undertaking this initiative. We've also come to a place where we have assigned very specific roles to educators and learners, or teachers and students. We now see the role of the instructor or the teacher fundamentally as being a content expert. And the fundamental role of the learner is to receive the content from the expert. And that role seems very, very fixed at the moment, for the most part. And we've also done something interesting with our diverse ways of knowing. We've privileged a certain kind of knowing, intellectual knowing, above many other kinds of knowing that we embody. The knowing of the heart, the knowing of movement, the knowing of musical expression, those kinds of things. We've placed those in a different category than intellectual knowledge and reified it in some way. So the original inspirational structure for this juggernaut educational enterprise that we've undertaken over the last couple of hundred years, that original inspirational structure is mostly buried. At the back of the classroom is where we find that person today. And if I ask myself, for me, what is the original inspirational structure of education? It's this: the mentorship of young people, the cultivation of identity and purpose and creativity among young people on the path from childhood toward adulthood. It's a very deep purpose, mentorship. We've been doing it for a long time. Ever since humans became modern architecturally, anatomically, every human culture places mentorship at the core of its purpose and of its community. And for a long time, and in many cultures, mentorship was a highly developed art and science. Even today, there are many cultures where mentorship is deep and purposeful and important and foundational to the development of all people. But in the West, I believe that we have not exactly abandoned mentorship, but we've lost a little bit of our sight of it. So much of our effort these days is focused on mentorship. We've applied our instincts and our energies to other kinds of things. And in the world of education, mentorship can be almost an invisible presence. If you're not sure, it's easy to verify this. It's easy to verify that mentorship has become less important than perhaps it should be. It's easy to do a very rigorous, quantifiable, scientific study about this. Just ask a student. Ask a student about their experience of mentorship. And some students, most students perhaps, will report that they've had at least one or two experiences of mentorship. One or two moments of bright and singular clarity and purpose and connection amidst a lot of other stuff that is just kind of about marking time. It's a real challenge for them. So I think we could learn something from this, similar to what the Egyptians learned. Adding new parts to this existing structure of education often makes things worse. We've added a lot of machinery into it. And I don't think anyone's clear whether we're actually making progress. We have some significant challenges in our educational environments right now. We tend to find ourselves down blind alleys quite often. We tend to get into situations where there are predetermined outcomes or self-limiting scenarios that aren't exactly what we envision, but somehow seem to emerge and manifest naturally and spontaneously as we just go about doing our thing. Of course, everybody recognizes that the situation is becoming more turbulent and more tense. Everywhere in education we see this. All the way from K through 12 through post-secondary and beyond, education is a little tense right now. People sense that a transformation's afoot. No one is clear about what the nature of the transformation will be. It's impossible to see it clearly and acutely, but everyone senses that something is off, something needs to change, and many of us are trying to figure out what that is and how we should go about doing it. One of the things we know for sure, these layers we add on top of the structures we currently have, they make it worse. They limit us increasingly in terms of innovation, renewal, growth, creativity, and change. So it makes us stuck. And that's a problem. And so what we do when we feel stuck is we often cleave back to the notion of tradition in education, that the traditions of education are somehow sacred, and we should do what we can to preserve them. Personally, I don't agree with that notion. I think we should toss out what we need to toss out and keep what we can. Learn from it and move forward. We've had 100 years of opportunities to figure this out. We've been formally education, what makes a good learning environment, for about 100 years. About the same amount of time the Egyptians spent between the first step pyramid and the second masterful pyramid. That's a long time. You can learn a lot in 100 years. Education's been a bit quirky, though, in this regard, because we've by and large ignored what we've learned. It's a bit strange. For example, we still lecture. Now, the lecture was designed 1,000 years ago for people who can't read, and we are still doing it. We are still adapting to the notion that there's a thing called printing. It's taking a long time for us to adapt and modify what we do. Textbooks is another example. If we were to start today without our biases and opinions about the role of textbooks, if we were to start today and ask ourselves, how should we best share information with learners? How should we best make available the kinds of resources that we know would be useful to them in their learning? What should we do? If we ask those kinds of questions in a neutral sort of way, without prejudging it, we would not be thinking about printing presses and textbooks. We'd be thinking about the web, content management systems, digital creativity, digital communities. Of course we would. The textbook continues on as a stubborn, belligerent thing in the age of the digital community. Classrooms. Classrooms were originally designed to separate people from the world, to create a kind of safe enclave where study and reflection could happen. It's a wonderfully holistic and integrative kind of purpose. But now, as we find young people going out into a world that's increasingly complex and interdisciplinary, it's very difficult to make a justification for this kind of separation that is so traditional. I don't think that we should bulldoze all the buildings with classrooms in them, but I think we should use those buildings differently than we do today. Because we can build something new. Not for the first time. We've been able to do this for 100 years or more. But now it's becoming easier, and now there's a kind of urgency to build something new as the world's problems become more urgent, and as the solutions to those problems become increasingly about collaboration, community, creativity, personal engagement, working across the disciplines, working beyond traditional structures. We can build something new, and we should. And we should build it from the ground up. Just as the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was built from the ground up, because it's impossible to rebuild something that is older and make it new again. It's impossible for us to take the educational system we have now and add stuff to it so that we get to this new thing we envision. It's not possible. All that will happen is we'll add more layers and more levels to it. It's impossible to repurpose what we have. We are going to have to decide to discard some things. That seems obvious. Sometimes it's best to build from scratch. And personally, I think that's what we should do. So if we did that, if we took it by the throat and said, okay, let's rebuild it, what would it look like? Paradoxically, it would look like something very old. Transformative learning beyond the classroom is the foundation for me, anyway. And that's where the moment of genius is as well, for me. The theme of these talks is the moment of genius. And in my work, that moment comes in recognizing that the genius is in the learning community. It's in the learners, or as you might call them, the students. It's in the coming together of that community for purposeful activity in the real world. The genius is shared, it's communal in a profound way, and the instructor or the facilitator is at the side. I'm in this photograph. I'm off to the left, off to the side there, away from the center. That's where I should be. The learners should be at the front, in the center, doing their work. When they do work in this way, in a context of mentorship that promotes creative engagement and communal participation, there's a kind of sacredness that returns to education. There's a discovery, a sense of wonder, a sense of purpose that most young people are yearning for and searching for, and some of them find, but many don't. And along with that, there's an encouragement and for challenge, risk, and personal growth in getting out of the comfort zone, getting out of the classroom, getting out of the world of safety, taking a risk, even a serious risk, because that's what life is for. And all of that leads to creativity in the real world. And we all know that creativity is the root and soil and leaf of every wonderful human thing. Creativity is foundational to every culture, to every time. It's a jewel, and it's a delicate thing, a fragile thing. And it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to find that creative spark, as many people have said today, when you're sitting in a classroom on a rainy morning in Vancouver, watching the power go by. So in a nutshell, if we were to distill all of this down into one or two basic ideas, for me it would be this. It would be the rediscovery and re-implementation of some very old notions. Self-awareness, empathy, and character. These are old terms. They're completely out of vogue today. People use different, more fancy-sounding scientific terms for this. But these are the right terms for me, because they describe very precisely and very holistically what I'm talking about. Self-awareness is what we know about ourselves, about our inner lives, our values, our purpose, our direction, our histories. Empathy is how we feel about other people, how we feel about the world and the state of the world. And character is what we do with our self-awareness and our empathy. And when you look at the history of mentorship in every culture, these are the kinds of things people focus on. The encouragement and facilitation of self-awareness, the work of empathy in communities and in groups of all kinds, and the building of character. Although these items are foundational to human development, they are almost never emphasized in academic environments. And for me, that's a large problem. It's maybe the main problem. That sometimes we talk about these things, but we don't usually actually do them. It's something many recognized, and it shouldn't come as a real shock for you to hear me say this. There's a disconnect here between what we say and what we do in the world of education. But if we're going to match what we say with what we do, then I think we also need to match new and old approaches to education. This is not about, in my mind, leaving behind what we've done in the past to invent something completely new. It's about synthesis and integration. Our educational possibilities include both sides of this, ancient and modern. And if we do that, there are some wonderful new possibilities we can discover. First, and most important to my mind, learning communities roaming the world. No classrooms. We don't need classrooms. We need classes. We need experiences. But we don't need to have them in classrooms. We could, in theory, without using a bulldozer, we could, in theory, get rid of all of our classroom experiences tomorrow and take people where the learning is, out in the world. That's where they're going to discover it when they go out into the world of career anyway. We should get them used to that. And many educators are trying to do that. No classrooms. And no lectures. The lecture as performance. The lecture as a performance intended to be in service of personal and professional transformation. The inspiring lecture. That's an awesome thing. And we shouldn't get rid of that. But when you ask young people, where do you hear inspiring lectures in the world today? They typically don't talk about their classroom. Typically, they talk about TED Talks. right? And online content, open resources, open systems. We now have the ability to facilitate the learning community with the support of digital technologies. I am not a fan of replacing the classroom experience with an online experience completely. Already, we're only a few years into that experiment, and already we can see that it's not holistic enough. It's not integrative enough to make a robust learning environment for young people. You need both. You need people to be together, seeing one another face to face, out in the world, doing engaging and interesting things. And you need them to have those experiences facilitated by online environments. Social media, digital communities, learning management systems that allow them to bolster their work in the real world with content and information and facilitation online. A blend of those things. And learner-built programs. We have many, many pathways and structures for young people to follow through their educational paths. And they do it in a way that is often not self-determined. Usually it's not self-determined. Usually they just follow step by step by step. And then they get out into a world where there are no steps. There are no set paths. No known routes that will certainly lead you to success. So personally, I think we should deconstruct the pathways. We should cross the disciplines. Start to work together to find more holistic ways of encouraging young people to bootstrap their own adventures in education. So, all of that sounds very heretical, perhaps, or controversial, or obvious, depending on your point of view and where you find yourself in academic culture. But if we were to try some of these things, how would we get there? I have 4 suggestions. 1, learner advocacy. This is already happening in a big way. Learners now have the freedom to go anywhere to study. One example of this is Google searches. The top Google searches currently for post-secondary education now involve searches for online schools, online experiences, distance learning, experiential learning in the real world. The bricks and mortar universities, all of them, even the traditional high-status bricks and mortar universities, get fewer searches than the online ones do. Learners are looking for something different. We should maybe pay attention to that in the world of traditional educational academia. Another theme that I think is crucial is instructor professional development. This is a tough nut to crack. We're shifting from a world in which the instructor is a content expert and solely that, to a world in which the instructor is a kind of facilitator, a mentor, someone who assists learners in developing, creating, fulfilling their communities and their work in their own development. That's a deep skill, a deep set of interconnected skills, and it's not something that comes easily to everyone. But if we're going to rebuild education from the ground up, this is something that needs to happen in a large and sustained way. Many, many institutions are trying to move toward a geekier environment, a geekier culture, and I think that's awesome. That's what we need to do, because eventually the digital tools and communities that are emerging, especially the hybrid environments that allow us to be in person and also in the digital space, those are going to replace, and I mean completely replace, a lot of bricks and mortar universities. Best and most obvious and most recent example of this is the independent bookstore. 10 years ago, people thought that independent bookstores would survive. People thought they would thrive. They thought that book culture, the culture of readers, was sufficiently strong to carry independent bookstores forward. And it has not been, not even close. We still read books. We read just as much as we have ever. But we seldom visit bookstores. I think something very similar will happen to most universities. We'll still go to university. We'll still learn many, many things, many interesting things. But I wonder how much we'll visit the campus. And governments could assist with this, I think. especially with the learner-built program, the notion that learners can choose pathways that suit them rather than predetermined pathways, to get credit, to get formalized, government-recognized credit for doing something other than following the predetermined blocks. This is also happening, too, in a large way. Not so much yet in Canada, but in many other places. But as governments start to see the inevitable avalanche of change in post-secondary education in particular, I think we'll start to see some pivoting from them and some movement in this direction. So let's go back to the Egyptians for a moment. This photograph here is of the Grand Gallery, which is a monumental, fascinating structure inside the Great Pyramid. It's one of the greatest architectural feats ever devised by humans. And around this Grand Gallery, there are more than 2 million blocks making up the rest of the pyramid. But they only used 3 kinds of stone. Simple. Something immensely complex, built with simple materials. So, we have millions of educational building blocks. But I think we only need 3 fundamental approaches. One is epistemological approaches, approaches to our ways of knowing, how we know, what we know, how we pursue knowledge. Interpersonal things, how we work with others, how we do teamwork, how we lead, how we follow, how we mentor. And themes of personal growth, intrapersonal, how we develop as people, how we discover our values and our character moving forward in our lives. To my mind, those 3 themes are essential and foundational, and they're very simple. And I think we should get to it. What are we waiting for? We've been talking about this in post-secondary education in particular for more than a decade. People have been talking about the urgency and the crisis of post-secondary education. But we haven't actually made a lot of traction in moving forward. We're in the midst of a very thorough deconstruction and rebirth. We haven't seen the rebirth yet. We're in the midst of the deconstruction. And that should not come as a surprise to anyone in this room. The educational system is ripe for transformation. And I think there are only really 2 ways to navigate this process for each one of us. This way or this way. One or the other. Now, sometimes, because the way we are as people, because of the way that human nature is, we resist seeing the inevitability of some things. Personally, I think this transformation is absolutely inevitable. There's nothing that can stop it. But often we get stuck there. We worry about what's coming. We don't know exactly what to do with it, and so we freeze. It's typical. It's normal. Every culture does it. The Egyptians did it. They built this monumental structure, the Great Pyramid. It was the tallest building in the world for almost 4,000 years. But after they built it, very soon after, their society fell apart. And they never built another structure of equal mastery. So that building, that monument stands alone as a relic and as a reminder, I think, of the fact that things change. And perhaps it's natural to think, well, is a similar fate awaiting us in education? Will education become a relic in some way? Well, I think that depends. I think it depends on what we do right now. Because I believe that this is the moment of change. The moment, this is it. You know, there's a swing happening. And you can feel it probably. It's happening right now. It'll be over in about a decade. But it's happening right now. So depending on what we do now, one of 2 things will happen, right? We'll either get further into crisis, or we'll find that sweet note of transformation that takes us forward to where we want to and need to go. But our reaction to this particular moment will be the determining factor. Whether we resist or rebuild. Our tendency, of course, as people is to resist because we're afraid of change. Our imperative is to rebuild. Take your pick. And thanks for listening.